met with three different instances in which injustice is lamented, addressed, and prepared for. Jeremiah, in our first reading, is a prophet who brought the word of the Lord to Israel, but he was met with imprisonment and abuse by the priest of God's people. Paul is addressing the Roman church, in which Jews and Gentiles are facing outside persecution for their faith, and are also attempting to out the other group from the church, rather than seeing one another as the people of God. And Jesus is preparing his disciples for the inevitable injustice that they will face, even pointing to the false accusations he will personally face to show that the disciples will receive similarly unjust accusations and treatment. And in the midst of the injustice witnessed in these readings and the injustice we witness in the world around us today, it's important to first consider the biblical view of justice, and to then consider what our response to God's heart for justice can be, rather than being drawn into perpetuating this cycle of injustice in our world today. And so, before we get into seeing how this relates to injustice in the world today, it's first important to think about what the Bible says about justice. And so, what is biblical justice? It's one of the fundamental characteristics that set human beings apart from other creatures that God created, and it's what we value. Justice is something that we inherently value greatly. Even back in Genesis, we see that human beings were made in the image of God, and are therefore God's representatives who rule the world by his definition of good and evil. According to the biblical justice that God sets forth, all humans are equal. All humans are created in his image, and all are bestowed with the right to dignity and justice and the right to be treated as such. And of course, as we all know, human beings do not always behave this way. Instead, even in the earliest parts of the Bible, we see humans rejecting God's principles of biblical justice, and instead beginning to define good and evil for themselves in a way that gives them advantages over others for the sake of self-preservation. The strong take advantage of the vulnerable, both at an individual level and at a greater societal level. And throughout all of this, the justice that God intended for people to exhibit is nowhere to be found. But out of this mess, God raises up a man named Abraham, and he positions him to start a new line of people with his family. This line of people that will be ruled with two key characteristics: righteousness and justice. And in the Bible, these are two key words that come up a lot. And righteousness, it refers to being a good person and being in right relationship with others and treating them with decency, fairness, and dignity, recognizing that all of them are made in the image of God, just like you. And justice can be used to talk about retributive justice, meaning that if I were to steal something from you, I would pay a consequence. That's retributive justice. That's the word. But the Bible, when it refers to justice, much more often it's referring to restorative justice. And in restorative justice, those who are unrightfully hurt or wronged, they're restored and given back what was taken from them. And this restorative justice, it includes going a step further and seeking out the vulnerable people who are being taken advantage of and helping them, taking steps to advocate for the vulnerable and to change social structures to prevent injustice. That's the difference between restorative justice and retributive justice. So taken this way, the combination of righteousness and justice that God dictates means a radical and selfless way of life in which people do everything they can to ensure that others are treated well and injustices are fixed. This is a theme that continues throughout the whole Bible. When God's people were shown injustice, such as when the Israelites were under Egyptian oppression, God stepped in and he showed them restorative justice just like he commanded them to show others. And of course, the sad irony is that the Israelites would later go on to oppress others, even after being oppressed themselves. And they ignored these very important concepts of righteousness and justice that God decreed that they should live by and that God showed them, lived out with them. He gave it to them, but they didn't share it with others. And so in response to Israel's ways of injustice, God sent prophets who declared the people of Israel to be wicked and guilty. And through the prophets, God called the people to repent of their sin and turn to God to be forgiven and recommit themselves to God so that he could lead them in righteousness and justice, knowing that they couldn't do it on their own. God wanted to save his people and to restore them, but they actively opposed many of the prophets and even mistreated some of them greatly, including Jeremiah. So in all places and at all times, people have actively perpetrated injustice, while others have benefited from the unjust social structures that they take for granted. Whether it be through active injustice or whether it be through being a passive bystander and allowing the injustice to happen, we have all participated in injustice in some form, whether it be actively, passively, or unintentionally. But thankfully, God has a solution for the injustice of humanity. By sending Christ, who was deemed to be fully righteous and just, to take the punishment for the sins of the guilty, God has made it so that all people can stand righteous before him. Not because of anything that they've done, but because of what Jesus did for them. This is a justice that is given to us. And the earliest followers of Jesus experienced this righteousness from God, not just as a new status, but as the power that changed their lives and it compelled them to act in new ways. If God declared someone righteous when they didn't deserve it, the only reasonable response for them or for us is to seek righteousness and justice for others too. This is a radical way of life, and it's not always convenient and it's not always easy. And doing so means courageously making other people's problems, my problems. It means making other people's problems your problems. It means reaching down to help them be lifted up, rather than being content in a position above them. This is what Jesus means by loving your neighbor as yourself. And this call is a lifetime commitment, and it's fueled by the words of the Old Testament prophet Micah. In the book of Micah, which is focused on social injustice occurring within the nation of Israel, it says that God has told you humans what is good and what the Lord requires of you: to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. But just because we associate ourselves with God, that doesn't mean that we are immune to committing injustice. We're not immune just by association. But when we are not actively pursuing God's heart for justice, we can be just as likely as anyone to be involved in injustice. And those who are quick to associate themselves with God, those who are quicker to defend their association with God than they are to reach out and to love people and to show God's love, they are primed to be part of the problem, to be honest. It's a place of pride, it's a safe place of complacency to say that by association, I'm fine, and by association with God, all I need to worry about is me and the people immediately around me, and not those who are in the world and need help. Having only an inward view of the Christian community we're in, we can lift up people within that community, but there are limits to it that we have to acknowledge. It's important to reach out in that way. And so if we're more eager to expend energy trying to defend ourselves or to defend ourselves from being called out as unjust, if we're more eager to defend ourselves in that way than we are to reach out and to lift up others, then we have a big problem where we are taking self-righteousness and pride over justice for others, and that's not God's heart for his people. And there's a friend of mine that I have to commend for living this out and being an example of looking beyond herself, looking not just at defending her own image of righteousness or defending her own association with God, but she actively will go out of her way to lift up others in any way she can. And her name is Mara, and I worked with her last summer at Imago Dei Village. You guys may know it. It's just outside of Clintonville here. And one thing that continues to amaze me about Mara is that she cares for people so much, and she fights for them. And I've seen this to be true in an extensive way over the last year I've known her. And when she cares for people, it's not just a warm feeling or a sense of hoping that things get better for them. But when Mara cares for people, She takes action to make sure that they're lifted up, and she gives them her time, and she gives them her earnest effort to put them in a better position today than they were yesterday. She's willing to take on the inconvenience. She's willing to take on the extra effort. She's willing to take on any kind of image that people may want to put on her for associating herself with people who don't have a glowing image of a perfect American Christian. She goes beyond that, and she loves well. So whether it be the students that she's worked with as a student teacher, or when she's worked with volunteer programs and she's committed her time and effort to those at college, or when we were with the kids at Imago Day last year, she gives herself for the sake of others with a consistency and with a passion that I am humbled by. Whether it be actively raising awareness and perspective and compassion to current social justice issues, or being the hands and feet of physically providing the needs to those who are in need right now, she is a warrior for justice, and I have the utmost respect for her for that. Even just 2 days ago, she took the time and effort to partner with others, collect donations from people she knew, and she went out and she purchased art supplies, toys, and books for kids who have been affected in the Minneapolis area. Because she's going to the University of Minnesota, and so she's there in that local community that has been so greatly impacted in a variety of ways. And so I've seen her consistently over the last month or so going out of her way to help physically and tangibly, even just in the little ways. And in other ways, she's also been an advocate for those who have not had a platform to be heard. And she goes beyond simply being aware herself or gaining understanding so that she can see something in a new way, but she seeks to learn so that she can better understand a person, a situation, and the varying and unique needs of people. And then she acts on it. She takes that extra step. And she understands that she cannot fix these widespread or systemic issues on her own, but that doesn't leave her paralyzed or overwhelmed or resigned in inaction. Rather, she does what she can, and she pushes the boundaries of what that entails. She actively seeks to lift the people she sees. She actively seeks out those who she can help today. She goes beyond herself. She doesn't look at a whole system and say, what difference can I make? She looks at the people around her and she asks, what difference can I make for you? And that is a huge paradigm shift for all of us to take. If we look at all of the problems in the world today, no, we cannot individually solve them. But if we look to the person next to us, if we look to the people in our community, if we look just to one person and we ask them, what can I do for you today? That's where change can happen. And that's what Mara lives out. And it's something that actually in Jesus' final words of our reading today, it's something that he points out for us to do as well. Jesus points to justice and to our response to justice in a way that you might not see at first glance. Because there are the words in the middle of the Matthew reading today that say, "For I have come to set man against his father and daughter against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household." And these can seem to be harsh words at first, but you have to understand the context in which they're being said. Because Jesus isn't just saying these words, he's referencing something. If you remember earlier when I mentioned the book of Micah in the Old Testament, and how that book was so focused on social injustices occurring in Israel, that's the book that Jesus is referencing when he says this statement. He's pointing directly back to Micah, one of the central books of the Old Testament that focuses on social injustice. And one of the main ideas of that book of Micah is that God is seeking justice, mercy, and humility from the people of Israel, and he calls them to look to the Lord, rather than trying to do it on their own, or rather than trying to rely and have hope in the people around them. And after Jesus makes known his heart for justice to his disciples through his reference to Micah, Jesus then makes it clear that there is a cost to consider in living out justice. Because he says, whoever finds his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. In taking action for justice, the cost to oneself is real. But the gain to consider in somebody else's life can be so much greater, even if you don't see it immediately firsthand. When we live out justice, yeah, I mentioned earlier, it can be inconvenient for us. It can have a cost to us. But when we focus beyond ourselves, when we are willing to take on any of that cost, it can be a small cost in perspective compared to the big impact it can make. And so doing just one right thing will make an impact. Whether it be locally here through the Clintonville Community Resource Center, or more broadly through another organization or group, one small action of support and justice now is better than waiting for some perfect opportunity to feel like you're making a big difference later. You may not solve all the world's problems by one action, but what is one action you can take today for the sake of someone else, to impact their world, to impact their life? And that's a big challenge for us, because it's not conceptual. It's not an idea of what can we do to make a difference. It's a very real question of what is one thing we can do today to make a difference. If we can't change a whole system with one action, how can we change one person's experience? That is where justice starts, and that's where we start. Amen.